how can things like this happen? I mean, running redundancy seems like a pretty easy thing to do. And here we are almost a week later. I don't know who to believe anymore or what to believe.
Yeah, well, I think they'll get to the bottom of it. But it just shows you how vulnerable our society can become. And it's going to happen more and more. There's a much bigger economic collapse coming. And people have to recognize that just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Do you think we'll see a stock market crash?
Stock market can always crash. I mean, it's very expensive because in order to prevent the stock market from crashing, they'll just print a bunch of money. And so we end up with a dollar crash instead of a stock market crash. And that's what I'm more worried about. The disaster that we're headed towards in the future is going to be not only much worse than what we experienced in '08, but much worse than it would have been had the government done the right thing and not interfered in the process and allowed for an even bigger decline in the stock market, allowed for an even bigger decline in the real estate market. And there's a commercial real estate crisis. I think the entire banking system is completely insolvent right now. It could collapse any day. The country is in a lot of trouble. We have been able to succeed in kicking the can down the road. We've delayed that inevitable collapse. It's coming. And every time we delay it, we just make it worse.
Peter Schiff is no stranger to those interested in the U.S. economy, finance, preserving wealth, and, of course, politics. I've interviewed Peter many times, so when Peter invited me to his stateside home in Connecticut, of course I said yes. Peter was not shy with his opinions about the presidential campaign, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, the CrowdStrike catastrophe, and Biden exiting the presidential race. It's interesting how all of these things happen just about the same time. Well, anyway, let's hear from Peter. Peter, great to see you on the stateside.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for coming by, Todd. Nice to see you again.
Appreciate you having us here in Connecticut. So, beautiful house. Great property.
Yeah, you caught me here. We don't spend that much time in Connecticut these days. In fact, we just got back from a few weeks in Europe, and I'm here maybe a couple more weeks and then going back to Puerto Rico.
Yeah. A lot has happened since I was in Puerto Rico. We podcasted a couple times, but recently, obviously, Biden has stepped out of the presidential race. There was an assassination attempt on, Donald Trump. What do you think about everything that's going on right now?
Yeah, if you were, I guess, writing a screenplay about an election cycle and you put all this stuff in there, they would think, come on, no one's going to buy that. But a lot of stuff has happened. I mean, really starting with the debate. And I remember, I watched the debate here in this house. And I was just very interested to see how Biden did, because I knew that all of the talk about Biden's, mental faculties wasn't hype. I mean, it was apparent to me that he had some issues there with dementia, senility, whatever it was. And so I was very interested to see how he could manage with a debate, because I'd seen his press conferences at the few that he's done, and they're not really press conferences. He reads from a teleprompter and then he leaves. Doesn't really engage the media, doesn't take any questions, doesn't speak off the cuff. So, I was sitting down, watching this debate, and just amazing. The minute he spoke, within the first question, it was, oh my God, it's even worse than I thought. He'd already lost the debate and the presidency in the first 5 minutes of that debate, just based on the way he spoke. But even worse than the way he spoke was the way he looked, the expressions on his face, especially when CNN would run the split screen and you'd see Trump talking and then Biden just standing there with that crazed look on his face, like he didn't even know where the hell he was.
Yeah.
And I even thought that is CNN trying to sabotage him? Why are they even doing the split screen? They should just have Trump. Don't even have Biden on camera, because he was losing more and more just by having his face on the screen. So ever since that, and then all the calls for him to step out and resign, and he's digging in his heels. Then you have the assassination, and I think that really is the catalyst because that catapulted Trump to a whole new level because now his odds of winning post the failed assassination attempt really shot up. And in my mind, he's not just a presidential candidate anymore. He's a living American folk hero. He's on a whole new level now. And so there's no way Biden's going to beat him. And so I think that's what really accelerated the pressure for Biden to drop out. And, it's interesting that the Democrats didn't really care that Biden, was senile or, that mentally he wasn't, really capable of being president. They didn't care. They were willing to elect him anyway because they kept that secret. I mean, it wasn't the best kept secret, but they still managed to keep it under wraps. The only problem they have is that now that the secret is out and everybody knows what they were trying to hide, he can't win. So that's their problem with Biden. Not that he's incapable of being president, but that he might not win. And so that's why he's stepping down. But he's not even resigning the presidency. He's staying president. He's just not going to run. But I don't see how Kamala Harris is in a better position to beat him. And I think once she debates him, I think her numbers will tank, and they're already low.
What do you think about the whole attempted assassination on Trump? I mean, there's so much. I mean, what a disaster from the, Secret Service. And I mean, they had some pretty outrageous pictures. I mean, they look very patriotic with Trump, putting his fist up in the air and then 5'4" women, guarding him after, he was just shot or other people were shot. I have no idea how they know that there weren't other shooters, but yet they were, he was completely exposed when they were taking him to the car. I mean, a lot of people think that was staged. I mean, what are your thoughts on the whole thing?
Well, I think it's ridiculous to think that, they set the whole thing up as far as a fake assassination attempt. I think the assassination attempt was clearly real. The only question, if you're going to try to advance a conspiracy theory, is not that they organized this thing as just to boost Trump's standing and to create a photo op. That photo that was captured, I don't think Donald Trump was posing for the camera. I think he was trying to let the crowd know that he was okay. Yeah. He wasn't even thinking about, photo ops. It just turned out that was a fantastic photo. It reminded me of the Marines on Iwo Jima from World War II. Yeah. Kind of like, and so it's a great photo. But I think if there was anything that doesn't really meet the smell test, it's how is it that the Secret Service was this incompetent? Now, maybe they were. I mean, with today, the way they hire people, it's all based on, equity and inclusion, not competence. So maybe that is how incompetent our Secret Service is these days, that it was that easy for this 20-year-old kid to get on the roof of the building that's directly opposite where Trump is speaking with that rifle and a rangefinder and his scope and all of his gear that he had, and nobody notices him, or actually people did notice him, but it didn't seem like the Secret Service cared. So I don't know. I mean, I'm more likely to believe that maybe, I don't know if it was an inside job or maybe some of the Secret Service agents were like, well, it wouldn't be so bad if he got shot. I don't know. Or they're just incompetent. They tried their best, and that's just as good as they could do, which would be scary if you're a presidential candidate, and that's the extent of your Secret Service protection. Although I don't know that Trump was given the protection that he deserved. I think the Biden administration was reluctant, just like they were reluctant to give Secret Service to JFK Jr., right? They've been a bit stingy. I mean, they love spending money in the government, apparently just not on Secret Service protection for their political adversaries. But no, I mean, I think that it was a legitimate attempt that almost succeeded. I mean, the guy got off a very good shot on Trump, and the only reason that he missed was because Trump happened to turn his head at the precise moment that the assassin was pulling the trigger. And he turned his head because he was looking at a chart he wanted to read, and that's what saved his life. And then once he got hit, he immediately dropped down, and I don't know how long it takes, to squeeze off the shots or what it was, but by then he was out of the line of sight. So he was very lucky that this assassination attempt failed because it was very close to success. And it wasn't even like the shooter missed. I think the shooter was on target. Trump moved. You can't help it if your target happens to move, And so, he got very lucky. But Trump and the Republicans are certainly doing what they can to make the most of that, to use it to their advantage. I mean, it dominated the convention. So I think it elevates Trump, again, to a folk hero, maybe even to a religious figure, because a lot of people think, well, God did this. Right? God saved Trump. Well, why did he do that? Well, because he wants him to be president. Right? So he's here doing the Lord's work. He's a modern day Moses now, taking us to the promised land. So I think it really enhances his stature. And I think even a lot of the president's critics have got to acknowledge the way he handled that situation. And, the bravery that he showed, and the fact that is a true leader. And that's what we're electing to. When we're electing a president, he's the leader of the country. And that's the kind of man that you want leading you. Right? And, even Zuckerberg had to acknowledge that.
I saw that
in an interview. So
I was surprised about that.
Yeah. So look, I mean, a lot of people, I think, that were going to vote for Trump anyway. Of course, this is just solidifies their strength of their support, and they're going to definitely want to get to the polls and vote. But I think the people who were undecided, I mean, this should tip them over the edge as to who they should pick. I mean, certainly when it was Biden. Now Biden's gone, but Kamala Harris, I think, is the most unpopular vice president in history. So how is she going to get elected when she has to run on a failed administration? As much as Biden wants to spin that the economy is great, it's the strongest in the world, and he gets all the credit, the voters aren't buying that, because they know what life is like. They know what's happened to their cost of living since Biden came to the White House. And so they know what it was 4 years ago. They know what their grocery bill was, their electric bill, and they see what it is now. And a lot of these jobs that Biden likes to brag about having created, these are second and third jobs that people have been forced to take. They were better off when they didn't need those jobs. But the fact that they're working nights and working weekends, because that's the only way to pay for the groceries or to keep the lights on, that's not something that Biden should be bragging about. People don't want to give him credit. They want to hold him responsible. And they're hoping that Trump can turn it around. And that's, I think, going to be a problem, because he can't. And one of the problems I had with the convention, which I think was otherwise a good, PR event for the Republicans, is that Donald Trump promised a lot of pain-free solutions, a lot of quick fixes. The minute I'm elected president, inflation's going away, going to be peace in the world, and your standard of living is going to go way up. All your problems are going to go away, and that's not going to happen. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't vote for Trump over Biden, but he's set the bar too high. Now, sometimes you do that to get elected because people want to vote for a positive message, but the country's in a lot of trouble, and the problems have been building up for a long time before Biden came to office. Now, he didn't make them any better. He certainly contributed to the situation, but so did Trump. And so we would need a different type of Trump in his second term if we really wanted to solve these problems, but they're not pain-free solutions. Things have to get worse before they get better. And, the voters are not prepared for that.
Well, you said a whole lot to unpack, and I definitely want to talk about, some of the points that you made, especially with the jobs and the economy and the next potential president, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris. But first, I want to talk about this cyber glitch that just happened on Friday, because we were talking earlier, and I was wondering whether you were even going to make it back from Europe. With a lot of flights were grounded, a lot of banking was shut down, a lot of newscasters were put out. Hotel where we stayed at last night, they were affected. It was Hilton. and they had. I mean, I was wondering why there were only 3 deep in the line, and 40 minutes later, we still hadn't. We weren't being helped. And usually, I'm used to checking in with my phone and skipping the front desk.
We were fine. I mean, we flew the next day, and we ended up with a very busy airport because a lot of people that were supposed to leave the day before were leaving the day we were traveling. So there were longer lines at the airport. But other than that, the flight was fine. We had no problems with our hotel. We came from London, so maybe, not as many businesses in London were as affected as maybe here in the States. But it just goes to show you, the vulnerability, when you are so dependent on technology, even in your example with your hotel room keys not working. Back in the day when a key was actually a piece of metal that you put into a keyhole and turned it wouldn't have mattered. But because you now have a card that has to be programmed, something goes wrong with the computers, you can't get into your hotel room.
Well, they didn't even know that they gave me the hotel room that they did. I mean, I was literally 10 minutes unpacking in my room and the door opened up. So, they had forgotten or, they double booked my room. So
their software wasn't even working.
Wasn't working at all. They couldn't even give you a key. They said if you leave your room, you have to jar the door or go back down to the front desk and ask them to take you back to your room, which is a disaster.
Once, back in the day before computers, they'd have it written down on a piece of paper. They knew who, they had a little ledger. They kept track of things.
They took the key off the wall. The key was missing. Somebody's in the room.
People, I remember when I was younger, I knew quite a few phone numbers. In addition to my phone number, my office, I had friends. I'd write a lot of phone numbers in my head. I don't have any phone numbers in my, because I was remembering if I lost my phone, I couldn't call anybody because all my numbers are in the phone. Because I don't dial any numbers anymore. You just push the button of the person you want to talk to, and it dials by itself. So, the way I, learned numbers was just by dialing them enough that you just remember them. But when you never dial them, the only reason I know my own numbers is because I tell them to people. When they ask for them.
Yeah. Some people, and I'm not trying to be conspiratorial here, but some people are saying that they don't think that this was a glitch, that this was some kind of a test run. And, I tell you, I spent a little bit of time, enough time to be dangerous with what I'm talking about. But I do know with a lot of software or just programming, you wouldn't typically just launch a fix or an update with something that would be so catastrophic without some type of testing, running some kind of redundancy. But before you answer that, I just want to show you a clip of something. So the CEO of CrowdStrike was actually interviewed, and I just want to get your reaction to it.
This is after or before the incident?
This is after.
All right.
Okay.
Mr. Kurtz, it's Savannah here in Milwaukee. You're in the cybersecurity business, and I certainly don't even pretend to understand this, but according to your statement, it was a single content update that has managed to shut down air travel, credit card payment systems, banks, broadcasts, street lights, 911, emergency around the globe. Why is there not some kind of redundancy or some sort of backup? How is it that one single software bug can have such a profound and immediate impact?
Well, when you look at the complexity of cybersecurity, you're always trying to stay one step ahead of the adversaries. Excuse me. Man, just 1 second, please.
Oh yeah, take a drink of water.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sure it's been a long night.
It's been a long night. We're always trying to stay one step ahead of the adversaries. And in this particular case, our systems are always looking for the latest attacks from these adversaries that are out there. So this content update went out, and as it does, and it's been doing for many, many years, obviously we've got a robust team that's looking at the safety and security and the quality of these updates. And we have to go back and see what happened here.
So Peter, the reporter, asked a simple question about redundancy. he didn't answer it. I mean, he was choked up. Obviously, maybe he was just tired of talking about it. But I mean, what do you think about something like that? I mean, you're in the business that you're in. I mean, we're all very dependent on.
Yeah, look, I mean, mistakes happen. I mean, I don't think there's any way that the company did it on purpose. I mean, all the damage that it's going to do to their reputation, who knows how many lawsuits they may have to deal with. So, yeah, there's no way they did it on purpose. The question is, how was it able to happen? Who screwed up? They'll get to the bottom of it. But it just shows you how vulnerable our society can become when, we're dealing, with computers to this degree. Now, of course, we're still better off because of all the labor and costs that are saved because we have these tools that we can take advantage of. But it's not all upside. There's obviously a downside. It doesn't offset the upside. I mean, we're still better off, and we're not going to go back to having no computers. But, hopefully as things progress, maybe with artificial intelligence, we'll figure out, better ways to do these things. But it's unfortunate because the company is there really to stop theft, right? It's cybersecurity. So the only reason we even need this is because of criminal activity.
Yeah, which is going to get worse. The
Well,
more we put online.
They go where the money is.
Yeah.
And if you're a criminal, you're gonna target, right? That's what Willie Sutton said. Why do you rob banks? Right?
Yeah.
Well, it's where the money is. Well, now you don't have to go to a bank to get at the money, right? The money you can access online.
I guess it just seems so elementary to me. And, when I look at, I mean, sorry sucks, right? I mean, that's not a very, you don't want to hear that.
Well, yeah, but what else has he got?
Well, I mean, at this point, right. But what I'm saying is, to me, it just, how can things like this happen? I mean, running redundancy seems like a pretty easy thing to do. You test something out, it doesn't work. They roll it back. Hey, we got to go back to the drawing board again. And here we are almost a week later, and we're still seeing the repercussions of this. I guess what I'm just saying is that for many, and, again, looking at both sides of it, one of the things that I've always admired about you is you put it out there that we have to really be careful what we're listening to as to whether it's fact or not, right? Because there are narratives that are pushed. I mean, you've said it yourself that the media, lies to us, and, you've said that the government numbers that are put out aren't accurate. And I guess just when we look at everything that's going on, I don't know who to believe anymore or what to believe.
Yeah, well, I think the bigger takeaway from this is that it just shows you that stuff like that can happen. And it's going to happen more and more when we finally get, a big blow up in the credit market, in the U.S. dollar market, that really causes a much more profound financial and economic crisis than what we experienced, with this event with the computers, but even much bigger things that we've had with COVID or with the 2008 financial crisis. There's a much bigger economic collapse coming, and people have to recognize that just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and people should try to be prepared for it.
You're an employer. You have a lot of people that depend on you. You've obviously been very successful for many years, decades. I'm just kind of curious, with everything going on in the economy, the upcoming elections, the potential for cyber attacks, threats, things like that. I mean, is there anything that you share with your wife or your family and friends that you haven't put out there that, like, what are some of the things that you're really concerned about? I mean, obviously, if we listen to your podcast, we know you talk a lot about finance, but I mean, is there like a bigger, with your experience and your exposure, anything?
Well, actually, my wife is concerned about a lot more things than I am. I mean, so if she had a podcast, it'd be even gloomier and doomier than the one that I do. But no, I mean, pretty much whatever I'm concerned about, I talk about. So I'm not pulling my punches. So it's not any worse, in my opinion, than what I'm presenting, but it's certainly not any better. A lot of people in the financial services industry, they sugarcoat everything. They want everybody to think it's great. And I know it's not. We have been able to succeed in, kicking the can down the road. And so we haven't dealt with the real consequences of the problems that we've created because we've delayed that inevitable collapse, but we haven't canceled it. It's coming. And every time we delay it, we just make it worse because that's the only way to delay it. Right? It's like if you're a drug addict and every time, the drugs start to wear off, rather than dealing with the withdrawal symptoms, you just take more drugs. You're going to have to deal with it eventually. You're just not dealing with it today, but now you're just making the problem worse because now you're even more dependent on the drugs. And when you eventually stop taking them, it's an even, bigger come down from where you were because of, how much drugs you've taken for the length of time that you've been taking it. And that's why it gets so difficult. Once you get the habit and it's really bad, it's so hard to quit. And that's, what's happened with us in debt and consumption and our whole economy. It's like we're so addicted to this that we can't quit. Even a guy like Donald Trump can't even lay it out there and tell Americans, hey, we're going to have to stop all this consumption and borrowing and spending. He wants to act like he can continue. We just have to elect him.
I hope you're enjoying the interview so far. I'd like to take a minute and just let you know that our podcasts are brought to you by none other than SachsRealty.com. If you're looking to buy or sell in Maryland, we hope we're your number one choice. But if you're anywhere else other than Maryland, you can visit SachsRealty.com, click on your state and city drop down to find someone close to you. This referral program is brand new to Sachs Realty, and if you're not finding someone in your city, feel free to send me an email and I'll be sure to connect you with someone that I trust. Now back to the show. So do you think it matters at the end of the day? I mean, some people say it doesn't matter who the president is. I mean, do you think we've gotten ourselves in in such bad shape that, no matter who's elected, the result or the trajectory of where we're headed, it will be the same?
No, I mean, I think it does matter in a sense that once we have the crisis, the way the government reacts to it is going to be very important. They can't stop it. They can't prevent it. But once it happens, they can make it a lot worse based on what they do. So in that respect, it's better to have, let's say, a guy like Trump than someone like Kamala Harris, at the helm of the ship after it hits the iceberg, right? I mean, we're gonna hit it. The only danger is that when we have the crisis, and if Trump is the president when it happens, the tendency is to say, aha, he caused it, right? Whoever is there when it blows up gets the blame. And so that is the risk. That's why it's like, well, gee, would it be better for everything to blow up while Biden was president so he gets the blame? But I think it's better if you have somebody who's more likely to do the right thing in the aftermath than somebody who probably has no chance of doing the right thing. So I think that Trump has a better chance of making correct decisions once the collapse is fully manifest itself. Because all the solutions, and they're not quick fixes, but they are solutions and they will work. But they all involve less government, not more government. They all involve, eliminating regulations and taxes and spending that are at the source of the problem. But the natural tendency of a politician, especially the Democrat, is to solve every problem with more government and not recognize that it was government that caused the problem that you're trying to solve with more government. And all you end up doing is exacerbating the problem that you're trying to solve, because the solution is to eliminate government and to allow free market forces to work. Now, free market forces, there's going to be losers. People are going to lose money if the free markets are allowed to function. And so that's what politicians are afraid of, because some of those voters are going to be upset. But the government doesn't eliminate those losses. It just changes the way they're allocated, the way they're distributed, and it changes the nature of the losses. In many cases, the losses are inflation. So instead of losing your money loses loses value, but you end up in the same place. Whether you have less money or the money you have buys less stuff, your standard of living is still reduced. But when the government comes in and tries to paper over these problems by creating more inflation, the distortions that it imposes on the economy do even more damage. And what we need is to allow a complete restructuring of the structure of the economy. We need a lot more manufacturing, a lot more production, a lot more savings, and we need a lot less consumption, borrowing, especially, consumer borrowing. We need more people who are in the service sector to move into a goods production sector. We need more people who are working for government, healthcare, education to be employed in more productive areas of the economy. And so that's a big change that needs to take place. And the government delays all that with their policies. They're trying to reflate all the busted bubbles. The markets are trying to burst those bubbles and replace them with something real, something that's lasting. But the government doesn't want that because, again, in the short run, there's always some pain, there's always some losers. And the politicians, are not willing to accept that because it means that maybe they won't get those votes and that they'll be out of a job.
How do you reduce the size of the government?
Well, it's easy. You just cut government. I mean, what you have to do.
What would you cut first?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of departments and agencies. I think when the United States government began, we had maybe 5 different departments. And, these were all added. The last one was Donald Trump added the Space Force. Get rid of that. I mean, what do we need that for? But, we can get rid of a lot of different departments, education, energy. There's a whole host of them that we don't need. Some of their functions can be consolidated into other departments. Like, we should get rid of Homeland Security. We didn't have that until Bush. I mean, why can't defense cover Homeland Security? In fact, that's what defense should be about, securing the homeland. Maybe if we didn't have so many of our troops all around the world, we could bring them home to defend our own country, including the borders or whatever. But the government has to shrink. The government has to spend a lot less money. Just like if you're a household and you have to cut back on your spending, you just look over all the things that you're doing and what can I eliminate? What can I cut out, right, that I don't need anymore? We need to cut a lot of government. Government was very small when, the founders first created the federal government. It was an afterthought, didn't spend much money. There was no income tax. There was no Social Security tax, but there were no deficits. The government was able to pay all the bills on tariffs, on liquor taxes, firearms, tobacco. That's all the government needed. And it was able to pay all the bills and not have any deficit. So we need to have substantial cuts in government spending. But unfortunately, most of the government spending today is just transfer payments, Social Security, Medicare. And so we have to have substantial cuts there too. And that is the big political problem, because you now have a lot of people who depend on this government money, but the government doesn't have the money. And there's no way to legitimately take it from the people who are paying taxes. So right now they're paying for it by creating inflation. But they're going to have to create so much more inflation to cover these costs that they're really going to impoverish the nation. So what has to happen is we have to come to terms with the fact that the government's promised much more than the taxpayer can deliver. And, the programs need to be cut. And there are ways, to cut it. I mean, I would like to get rid of Social Security, Medicare completely, just eliminate it. But pair that with a plan for how do we deal with all these people who, paid these taxes their entire lives, didn't save enough for their retirement, in part because they thought they were going to get Social Security. And so they didn't save money that they otherwise would have saved. And now they're in a situation where, but for Social Security or Medicare, they'd be broke. So I think we have to try to find a temporary way.
Well, they are broke.
Yeah. To handle
They're broke
this.
with Social Security.
Right. But I look at it as a welfare problem. People are impoverished, and we're going to help them. But we got to eliminate the program so that we don't create the same problem for the younger generations. The whole Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It could never work. It was doomed to failure from the day it was started. So we got to admit that it was a mistake and get rid of it. But what I think the solution is,
Just make a cutoff date.
well, we just eliminate it now, and eliminate the tax so people don't have to pay the taxes anymore. But we have to have some way of funding benefits for people who really need them. And that would only be for a certain period of time. And then, so that younger people would know, look, there's nothing there. You just got to save, for your own retirement, which is what everybody did before Social Security. And, Social Security didn't even apply to self-employed people until the 1950s. It started in the 1930s for workers, but they figured that if you were smart enough to employ yourself, then you were smart enough to save for your own retirement. But what we need to do is means test the benefits. So, there's no reason for wealthy retirees to receive a Social Security check, because all that's happening is their children are going to inherit more money. And why should the children of poorer parents be taxed to subsidize the inheritance of the children of wealthier parents? So you shouldn't be able to get Social Security until you've exhausted, your private funds, and not just income. If you have millions and millions of dollars worth of assets that you're going to leave to your kids, you should have to sell those assets before you ask other people to cover the cost of your retirement. Because people forget that there is no Social Security trust fund, that all the money that anybody paid into Social Security, they just paid a tax. In fact, it's like an income tax. There's no difference really legally between the payroll tax and the income tax. It's just that the payroll tax is only on wages, and the income tax taxes, capital gains and other things. But it's really an income tax. They're both income taxes. And just because you paid the Social Security income tax, you have no more rights to get that money back than your income taxes that you paid. I mean, that is the legal, definition. Nobody has a claim to the Social Security benefits. The government could eliminate them whenever they want. You can't file a lawsuit. It's not your money. And where the government gets Social Security money from is they get it from the new taxes. So if somebody is, 75 today and getting a Social Security check, the money is not coming from any of the taxes that he or she paid during their life.
For 40 years.
That money is gone. It was spent, right, on the Vietnam War, Iraq War, war on poverty, COVID relief, whatever. The money's gone.
Entitlements, other entitlements.
All the money that somebody gets in Social Security was taken from the paycheck of some younger guy. And in most cases, the people who are paying the Social Security tax are far less affluent than the people getting the checks. So it's a transfer from the young and the poor to the old and the rich. So that has to stop, And then other people, like, for example, myself, I'm 61. There's no reason that I should get any Social Security. Right? I have more than enough assets to take care of myself. And so they could just X me off, right? I don't need it. And I shouldn't get it. I paid a lot of tax in Social Security. I'm not paying that much anymore now that I'm in Puerto Rico. But when I was years before, I paid way more in tax than I would ever get back anyway. But it doesn't matter. That money's gone. That money's been spent. And, there are a lot of people that maybe are less affluent than I am that also don't need the money. But it isn't even a question of, do you like the money? Sure. Let's say you're a retiree and you get your Social Security, and so you can afford the dues at the country club. And maybe if you didn't get Social Security, God, I guess I'm going to have to cancel my country club. Well, I guess that's what you have to do, because you can't take the money from a family that could barely pay the rent, and is struggling. And now you're taking that Social Security money. It was a horrible deal to begin with. But again, the public was duped into it. They believed the lies the government was telling them about how this was a big insurance plan, and the government was supposed to take the money and invest it so that the investment returns were supposed to pay the benefits, right? It wasn't supposed to be a Ponzi scheme, but of course it was a Ponzi scheme from day one. The government lied to the public about the nature of Social Security. It was really a gigantic fraud. They tried to make it sound like it was an insurance plan. That's why they call it premiums, beneficiaries, trust funds. But the whole thing was a lie from the very beginning. And it's about time we told the truth about Social Security. I mean, it's too late now, but we should have told the truth decades ago. But now, it's an even bigger problem. And you got an army of people who, they're a one-issue voter. They're not going to vote for anybody who's going to cut Social Security. That's why Donald Trump, he's not willing. No, we're not going to touch Social Security. We're not going to touch Medicare, right?
Yeah, it would scare.
Well, you're not going to make a dent in the deficit. You're not going to take, any significant amount of inflation away unless you cut entitlement spending. If we're committed to not cut entitlements, then we're going to have massive inflation, as far as the eye can see.
Interesting. Another way we could save on our government spending would be to incentivize them to not spend all of their budget. I mean, I have a lot of friends of mine that have been in government positions and, they had these budgets. And if they don't spend all the money by the end of the year, then their budget would be cut by, for the next fiscal year. And so they, spend it. And a lot of people say, hey, but we spend it on products that we would use, whether they buy extra toilet paper or whatever. But there really isn't, or that I know of, any incentives for them to save money. So,
yeah, I mean, we could change the pay structure so that to the extent that they are under budget, that they can get a bonus of a certain percentage of that budget so that they're incentivized. But, the key is just to limit what government
just
can
do a good job.
Well, they're not going to. I mean, it's hard to
be good stewards of the money.
Yeah, but they're not going to do that. They're politicians. I mean, that's why you really have to limit what they can do and what they can even spend money on, which the Constitution was written to do. It's just unfortunate that it's no longer enforced, and the government gets to do all sorts of things that are not authorized by the Constitution. But if the government just had a lot less money, then they'd have to spend less. And there should be a requirement, I think, at this point, that the budget be balanced. So if
a balanced budget?
Yeah. So if there's something worth paying for or worth doing, then you got to pay for it. Right. And if you're not willing to pay for it, then don't do it. Right. Because the voters they'll take whatever they can get that's free. So if you promise some new program and the cost is zero, but there's some type of benefit, well, then fine, I'll take the benefit. But if you say, no, there's a cost and a benefit, here's the new program, and here's how much your taxes are going to go up to pay for it, then a lot of people might say, you know what, I'll do without it. Forget about it. Let's not do it. That should always be the choice. It shouldn't be, we're going to have this new government program, and it's not going to cost you anything because we're just going to borrow the money, and we're just going to, because no one cares. And, nobody sees the relationship between the borrowing of the money and the inflation that comes down the line and how that impoverishes them anyway. I mean, the inflation tax is how we're paying for all of the government spending that we're not paying for with taxes because we have to pay for it somehow. We don't get any government for free. The only question is, how do we bear the cost? And it's actually cheaper to pay the taxes than to suffer the inflation. Inflation taxes is actually worse.
Interesting. Let's talk about the stock market. There was an article on the Motley Fool published recently, and it says 2 historically flawless metrics suggest the stock market can plunge. And one of these metrics, Peter, and I've heard you go toe-to-toe about the money supply. I heard, it was like a debate with you and Professor Hankey talking about money supply and inflation. But, looking at the chart, they say like for the last 90 years, we've had a pretty, steady flow of money supply. I know you'll have something to say about that, but, but that the M2 is a pretty flawless metric as to, determine whether we're going to, go into some type of recession. And I think, the last massive reduction of the money supply was the Great Depression. So, I mean, what do you have to say about that? Because there's a chart here that really shows since the 60s, it goes back, a long time. And now all of a sudden, we're looking at, this negative 3.4%.
Well, yeah, money supply really started to blow up in the 60s. That's why we had the high inflation of the 70s. In the 1960s, gold was $35 an ounce. Now it's $2,400 an ounce. So that's a reflection of the inflation that has been created. Of course, not just gold, but the stock market, real estate, everything is a lot more expensive now than it was in the 1950s because of inflation. And that's just going to get worse. The pressure on the politicians to create inflation is much greater now than it was then. And they're doing it in an economy that's far weaker because in the 1960s, we still had our manufacturing base. We were still a net exporter of manufactured products. America was still the world's largest creditor nation. Now we're the biggest debtor. Now we have $1 trillion a year trade deficits. We had a lot of savings. Americans, saved money.
They made money with their money in the bank.
And when they bought stuff, they weren't using credit cards. Most people who bought a car didn't take out a car loan. They paid for the car. The only real debt that you had back then was a mortgage. People wouldn't have borrowed money to buy, appliances or to take a vacation or to buy gas or groceries the way they do now. I mean, now it's just a gigantic credit bubble. So the potential for severe inflation is much greater than it was, at any point during, the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. And we've already seen that. I mean, the inflation that we've experienced over the last few years, if we measured it the same way we measured the 1970s inflation, if we had the same CPI, we would see that we actually had worse inflation during than any of the years of the 70s. And even now, where it's pulled back to around 3.5, if we measured that properly, it's more like 6 or 7, which is still very high. I mean, people want to wonder, why is Biden so unpopular when inflation has come down? Because it's still very high. Inflation is destroying the purchasing power of people's incomes, of what little savings they have. And that's only going to get worse.
So this contraction of the M2, I mean, do you see that as an indicator that
it only contracted briefly because it went up so much, but it's already starting to expand again. So the contraction is over. But people look at that contraction, you can't ignore the expansion that came before it, because if you look at the trough of that contraction, it's still way up there compared to where we started. Tremendous amounts of money was created during COVID, and we've barely, withdrawn much of that liquidity. It's still there, and now they're adding to it, and it's going to continue because the interest burden on the national debt is already now about $1 trillion a year. It's going to be $2 trillion by the end of next year. But the government can't pay that, and it's not going to stop there. I mean, we got almost a $35 trillion national debt. But as that debt matures, it has to get rolled over at higher rates. Meanwhile, we're running $2 trillion per year plus deficit. So we're adding a couple of trillion. And that's, without an official recession. The potential is for the annual deficits to go to 4 or 5 trillion. And then we got to finance that. So the numbers are just so large at this point that inflation, I think, is the only viable option that the bankers or the politicians believe they have. There's no way we can pay the debt. We don't have the integrity to default on the debt, so we're just going to create inflation. That's all. That's the only thing they're willing to do. Now they have to deal with the consequence of inflation, which, okay, they'll blame it on other people. It's greedy corporations. They're gouging the customers. Maybe it's OPEC. Maybe it's Putin. I mean, you can create some kind of boogeyman and blame the inflation. But they're never going to accept responsibility for creating it. But that's exactly what they're doing.
Do you think we'll see a stock market crash?
Stock market can always crash. I mean, it's very expensive. And so if it were just to revert to the mean, that's a big crash if it went there quickly. So it's always possible, but it seems unlikely because the Fed can always interfere by creating more money. And so we end up with a dollar crash instead of a stock market crash. And that's what I'm more worried about, is the dollar crashing, not the stock market. Because in order to prevent the stock market from crashing, they'll just print a bunch of money. And so it's the dollar. So the price of your stocks don't go down that much, but the value of the money that you get when you sell your stocks, that's what goes down.
Right.
Or the value of the dividends, to the extent that you have a dividend on your stock. Of course, a lot of stocks don't pay dividends at all. But those that do, the purchasing power of those dividends will be dramatically reduced, even if the stock doesn't crash. But the money crashes, so your dividends don't buy you as much.
Yeah. So, when we had, before the GFC in 2006, I believe it was a stock market crash. And a lot of people, just based on their sentiments, they pulled their money out of the stock market, which proved to be a bad thing to do because it did go back up again.
Yeah, well, the big drop was in '08. I don't think in '06. And the market kind of bottomed out by early '09. But yeah, we had a huge rally because of QE1, QE2, QE3, 0% interest rates. The Fed did everything it could to prop up financial assets, and that included real estate. But that did a lot of damage, because what that did was prevented a healthy restructuring of the economy that would have gotten to the core of the problem that led to the financial crisis and the collapse. We didn't do any of that. Instead, we just inflated an even bigger bubble to delay having to deal with the consequences of the prior bubble. But now the disaster that we're headed towards in the future is going to be not only much worse than what we experienced in '08, but much worse than it would have been had the government done the right thing and not interfered in the process, and allowed for an even bigger decline in the stock market, allowed for an even bigger decline in the real estate market, and allowed for a real healthy restructuring of the economy back in '09, 2010, 2011. Instead, we just made all the underlying problems that caused that crisis much worse, which is why the next crisis will be even worse than the last one.
I say, I guess the reason I say 2006, because I know there was a dip, and a lot of the confidence, we saw people taking their money out of the stock market. They had lost money. They took it out of the stock market and they invested in real estate. And I think that was right before the real estate bubble burst. Was really just a major
I think
influx.
That really started earlier, like with the tech bubble burst 2000, 2001. And so I think a lot of money that was going into the dot-com stocks was going into real estate. And, real estate was already rising before 2000. It started to go up like 96, 97, 98. But what happened after 2000, when the stock market crashed, there was a little bit of a pause. But then real estate just took off because a lot of that money, and what really ignited it was the Fed took interest rates down to 1% after the stock market crashed. And then what people did with all that cheap money was buy houses, because now you can get a teaser rate on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage where for the first few years, your payments was 2% or 3%. And people had never seen mortgage rates that low. Prior to 2008, mortgage rates were like 8%, 9%. And, there were no adjustable rate mortgages. There were no teaser rates. And all of a sudden, money became very cheap and lending standards went down. You didn't need a down payment. You didn't need to document your loan. You didn't even have to prove your income, right? The liar's loans came into play. And so a lot of money was, going into the real estate market. And of course, as real estate started to go up, it sucked in even more money because of the leverage. Because all real estate has to do is go up 10%. If you put 5% down and real estate goes up 10%, you've doubled your money, right? And so that's what people were doing. Goes up 20%, you've quadrupled your money. People were getting rich, you remember, in 2005 and 6, kids that got out of college and that just happened to buy a condo were getting rich because they bought that condo. They were making way more money on their condo than at their job. And then their friends who didn't buy, who rented, were very jealous because they didn't have any of the money, right? They were paying rent. And so that created even more incentives. Everybody, had to keep up with the Joneses. You talk about FOMO. There was tremendous FOMO in the real estate market. You had to buy a house. And then people, well, if one house is good, two are better than three. People were buying multiple homes because you couldn't lose.
Yeah, I had neighbors that were investing in real estate that had no idea what they were doing.
Yeah, I remember I'm reading
2006.
this one article, this one kid that they said he was some kind of, like real estate tycoon, or he was like, but he said that he always overpays to capture the opportunity. Like he said, like whenever there's a house, I'm just going to pay as much as I have to because I don't want to miss out on that opportunity. Like no matter how much I pay, I can't lose because whatever I pay, somebody else is going to pay more. Right? That was the attitude. That
sounds like 21 and 22.
You couldn't lose.
That's right. We just had one of those.
Yeah.
We hadn't seen in our lifetime real estate prices drop. I mean, we were always looking at 3 to 5% year-over-year increases in the value. Yep. And so if we were to have something, some kind of a stock market scare now and, some massive sell-off where people, they were just liquidating their stocks to become liquid. Do you think that we'd see them invest in real estate again? Or do you think that we would remember that real estate prices can fall?
Well, I guess it may depend on what the Fed is doing, at the time, where interest rates are.
But the Fed dropped interest rates back in 2007 and it did nothing.
No, I mean, it did. I mean, the real estate market is much higher. I mean, real estate prices are hit record highs.
But they crashed. And I mean, I was buying houses in 2009 that were selling for 200 and some thousand for 50,000.
Right. Because the bubble popped because a lot of the buyers of the subprime loans went back, they wouldn't buy them anymore when they all defaulted. They couldn't get the credit. A lot of the teaser rates matured. And even though the Fed had lowered rates, they still weren't low enough for those teaser rates. But also you had the dynamic of when people buy a home, let's say I paid $500,000 for a house and it's only worth $300,000. Why am I going to struggle to make the mortgage payment? There's no reason. So a lot of the defaults were a result of the economics. People made rational decisions, which is why it was so stupid for banks to let people buy homes with no down payments or such low down payments, because it was easy for them to walk away from a home where they had no skin in the game. And so there were a lot of other dynamics, but none of this would have happened but for the government guaranteed mortgages and things like that. But, we have a very different situation right now because in 2008, the banks were in trouble because of mortgages that were in default. People weren't paying because the house had lost value. And so that was bad for the bank because not only were they not getting the payment on the loan, but the collateral was not worth what they had loaned. So they were sitting on these losses. But the losses were really only a problem to the extent that the homeowner wasn't paying the mortgage. If the homeowner was paying the mortgage, they were fine, right? And of course, their commercial portfolios were in great shape because they were all paying, and low interest rates really increased the value of their commercial real estate books. And it was very easy for commercial borrowers to refinance at even better rates. So, they were in good shape. But today, I argue that the banks are in much worse shape than they were in 2008 when so many of them failed. And that's because they're losing money on all their mortgages. Every mortgage that they own, they're losing money on because they're sitting on mortgages where they're earning 2, 3, 4%. But their cost of money is 5%, 6%, So they're losing. They're not getting money at zero anymore. So mortgages that were profitable when interest rates are at zero, they're losing money on. And so it's not just the mortgages that are defaulting. In fact, if somebody defaults, that's a relief for the bank. They want people to default because then they can sell the house and rip up the mortgage. But people won't default because they want to keep those mortgages because the mortgages are actually assets to the homeowners because they've got all this cheap money locked up for 25 years. They're liabilities to the banks. The banks would actually pay you to pay off the mortgage, to get rid of it. So the banks, I think, are in worse shape, and there's a commercial real estate crisis. Prices have crashed. Banks are losing a fortune on their commercial real estate. So they're losing on their commercial because of defaults. They're losing on the residential because of higher interest rates. It's the value of the mortgage that's crashed, not the house price. And I always said to people when, they would call up my show and they would ask me, if they should buy a house. And I would say, well, as long as you take out a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, you got to take out the mortgage, because ultimately, from a financial perspective, you're going to make money on your mortgage, not your house. That's the opportunity. It's not buying a house. It's borrowing money for 30 years at 3%. That's what you want to do. And the only way you can get that loan is to attach it to a house. So go out and buy a house and get that cheap money, because inflation is going to wipe it out. And then meanwhile, your payments are low, and so that's what people are doing. But though that was bad for the banks. And I kept saying, and nobody else was talking about this, because everybody focused on how great it is that people can refinance their mortgages and reduce their payments. And I would say, yeah, it's great for the borrower, but what about the lender? The lender is having their income reduced, right? Whenever somebody refinances their mortgage and they were paying $3,000 a month and now they're only paying $2,000 a month, that's a huge loss for the lender. Now, the only reason the lender was able to eat that loss was because the Fed had rates at zero. But I kept saying they're not going to stay at zero forever. What's going to happen to the banking system when interest rates go up and the banks are sitting on all this underwater paper? Well, we know Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, these banks started to fail. And more banks would have failed if they didn't come up with this bailout plan. But I think the entire banking system is completely insolvent right now. And it could collapse any day.
Thanks for watching. As prudent Americans, no matter what you believe, from what you hear from our politicians, mainstream media, or from Peter Schiff for that matter, I believe it's important to listen to all sides and then decide for yourself what you should be doing, if anything. Part 2 of this 2-part episode will be aired next Saturday right here at Sachs Realty's YouTube channel. So now let's listen to a preview of part 2, and please share this video with your family and friends so that together we can build the most amazing online community.
I expect a crash. I mean, maybe 80, 90% decline in real estate prices in terms of actual money, real money. The government should have no involvement in real estate. There should be no Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA. Everything is screwed up. Our money's value has been destroyed, and it's about to be destroyed even faster. It lost 99% of its value in 100 years. It can lose another 99% of its value in 10 years. So you think stuff is expensive now. Add a couple of zeros. The Bitcoin people think, well, we could just artificially replace gold with a string of numbers, and it's going to have value. No, it doesn't. It's just the latest iteration of fool's gold. Eventually, the price has to collapse.
If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please consider doing so now. And hit that alert bell so that you're notified of other videos that we post, especially the part 2 of this Peter Schiff podcast. If you like the video, you can let Peter and me know by hitting that thumbs up. And by the way, by doing this, it will also help the algorithm spread this video to others around the United States. Your impact is priceless in a time of such uncertainty. Thank you. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.